Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah Birch and I do a whole bunch of things on this channel, but lately I have been focusing on true crime and telling stories that are dark and twisted, but also in some way psychologically fascinating and stories that need to be told. So if this is your first time here, welcome. If you have come back for another video, thank you so much for coming back. I appreciate it. And make sure you subscribe, like, share, comment, all of those things to help me grow my channel and support me on this new journey I'm going on. Let's just jump right into the case today. I have a crazy one for you that I bet you a lot of you have never heard before. You probably have heard this if you're a true crime fan, but if you're not, then this might be the first time you're hearing of the case of the Porco family. I will say a little bit of a disclaimer, a little bit of a trigger warning. There is a lot more blood and gore in this one than there has been in my past two previous videos. There will be some photos on screen of crime scenes. Nothing too crazy, to be honest, but you'll see blood. But it is essential for painting the picture of the story. So I'm just going to say that now, so be advised. So today's case takes place at a home on Broccoli Drive in Delmar, New York. This is quite close to Albany. Nestled on this quiet street was your average suburban middle to upper class home. This is where the Porco family lived, their ordinary, normal day-to-day lives. Peter Porco, the dad in this family, was 52 years old when this case takes place. He was working as a court clerk and his wife Joan Porco was working as a speech pathologist. The two of them raised two sons together. The older son was named Jonathan and the younger son was named Christopher. Jonathan was the older of the two brothers and definitely was a good example for his younger brother. He had his head on straight. He had a good attitude towards life. He went on to become a naval officer when he grew up, and he was stationed predominantly in North Carolina. However, Chris, the younger brother, was having a harder time maturing and growing up. When this case takes place, it's in 2004, and at this time, Chris Porco would have been 21 years old, and he was in and out of school, flunking out of university, flunking out of college, and just kind of making a mess of his life. Those who have told the story in the past would describe Chris as the troubled child, or, we have one in every family. Some might even argue that I'm the one in my family, but there's always a sibling that takes, a little bit more effort to parent, and they're a little more unruly and a little bit more unwilling to just go along with things. They kind of want to forge their own path and not really listen to people, and Chris Porco takes that to a whole other level. He was quite spoiled. He was kind of seen as like maybe the baby in the family and given everything he wanted in this life and just assumed that he had his parents wrapped around his finger. And even when his parents didn't exactly give him what he wanted, he'd find a way to get it anyway. Chris and his parents, there was a lot of animosity between them, a lot of tension, because Chris was failing out of his degree at the Hudson Valley Community College, and he was also stealing money from his parents. Not a good look. While on a trip away to England in 2004, Chris received an email from his mother, and she was not very happy, and this was in regards to his grades. Joan had received a copy of his grade report from the Hudson Valley Community College, and she was quite appalled at what she was seeing. In the email, she wrote, and I quote, "You just left, and we can't believe our eyes. As I look at your interim grade report, you know what they say, 3 strikes and you're out. Explain yourself." So Chris ghosted her for a while, but eventually he did reply to these sort of accusations in a message to his father, and in this message, Chris wrote, "Obviously, they are incorrect. My lowest grade that I got on anything was a B on a physics test. Don't jump to conclusions. I'm fine." And Chris had blamed this whole situation on a logistics error at the registrar's office instead of just taking accountability and said, "I fucked up." So he flunked out of the Hudson Valley Community College, and he actually got admission into the University of Rochester. And the only reason he got admission into this university was because he forged transcripts from his past college to get into this new university. The fact that he got into this university got his parents off of his back for just a little while. But the issues didn't stop in terms of his academics. His parents were also very concerned about the way that he was spending money and how irresponsible he was with money. Despite the forged transcripts to even get into the university, in the fall of 2003, Chris was asked to leave the University of Rochester because of his poor grades, so he flunked out once again. He did end up getting readmitted the next year, but he had to take out a $31,000 loan to pay for tuition, and he signed his father as his co-signer for this loan without the consent of Peter. I'm pretty sure that's illegal, is it not? And his parents had no idea about the $31,000 or about how he was going to use this money to pay for tuition, because he had told his parents that they didn't need to worry about tuition, everything was fine. because the University of Rochester was actually covering his tuition because a professor had misplaced a final exam of his. So as some sort of recompensation for this mistake, they're just going to pay for his tuition. And I guess his parents believed him. I don't know. I've never heard of that happening once in my life, but maybe it does. Let me know in the comments. 2 weeks before this case takes place, Peter had furiously confronted Chris again because, once again, Chris had used his father unknowingly to Peter as a co-signer for another loan. As a response to this, Peter wrote, "Did you forge my signature as a co-signer? What the hell are you doing? You have to call me to discuss this. I'm calling Citibank this morning to find out what you have done, and I'm going to tell them that I'm not going to be a co-signer." The following day, Peter was notified once again that his son had actually used his name as a co-signer on one other loan, and this loan was used to pay off not his tuition, not his outstanding debt, but a yellow Jeep Wrangler with massive four-wheel tires. Basically, the least inconspicuous vehicle of all time. My boyfriend drives a Jeep, so, I have nothing against Jeeps, but a yellow Jeep Wrangler is, that's a statement, You're making a statement by purchasing that car. Upon hearing about the Jeep Wrangler debacle, Peter once again wrote to his son, and this email writes, "I want you to know that if you abuse my credit again, I will be forced to file forgery affidavits in order to disclaim liability, and that applies to the Citibank college loan if you attempt to reactivate it or use my credit to obtain another loan." The email concluded, "We may be disappointed with you, but your mother and I still love you, and we care about your future." On the morning of November 15th, 2004, Peter Porco failed to show up to work at the court. Remember, he worked as a court clerk. So his coworkers were concerned about him, so they sent a court officer to go to his family home to check on him. So when the court officer arrived at the home at Broccoli Drive, he was knocking on the door, no response. So eventually he saw that there was a key in the front door, so he opened the door. And a few seconds within entering the home, he saw Peter lying face down on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Obviously, this court clerk immediately called 911, did not waste 2 seconds, and police came to the scene almost immediately. It didn't take long for officials to realize that Peter was deceased and had been deceased for some time, but they actually went upstairs and found Joan Porco, who once again is Peter's wife, was still actually clinging to life in the bed upstairs, the blood-pooled, blood-covered bed. This bed was covered in blood. And on the bed, just lying there out in the open, was a massive axe. Peter's cause of death was ruled as blunt force trauma to the head, specifically major axe wounds, obviously caused by the axe that was found on the bed. And it was determined that he had sustained 16 axe blows to the face, head, and jaw, and the axe had actually gone into the brain and penetrated the brain. Joan was also suffering from massive head trauma. Her eye had been removed from her face and her jaw was completely broken open. So they rushed her to the hospital where they were able to do some reconstructive surgery. However, Joan, as you will see in photos throughout this video, will go on to have lifelong disfigurement. And it is quite obvious when you look at photos of her that something very traumatic happened to this poor woman. Upon investigating at the home, officers discovered that the alarm, so the family had a security alarm system, it had actually been deactivated on the night of the murder by someone entering the code. And it was said that this code was only known by direct family members. So that would have been Peter, Joan, Jonathan, and Christopher. They also found that the home landline had been cut at some point throughout the murder so that Joan or Peter, if they were to survive, they could not call 911 or call for help. The dog, the family dog, had also been locked in the basement during this whole ordeal as well. So clearly the person who came in to do this, it was not just some botched robbery. It was premeditated, it was thought through, and they wanted to get away with this. They didn't want the dog to intervene, they didn't want the alarm system to intervene. They thought of everything. And I, just from listening to multiple true crime cases throughout my life, multiple is kind of an understatement, but I think that's always a bit of a sign that it was someone within the family or friend group. If a dog doesn't put up a fight, if a dog doesn't make a fuss, if a dog just willingly goes into a room or goes downstairs or goes outside with the intruder or the perpetrator, because normally if some random scary man comes in wielding an axe, a dog's gonna at least make a whimper at the very least, let alone barking or attacking or trying to do something, because it's a dog's instinct to protect their owners. So with all of these little clues, officers had an initial gut instinct that it was someone in the family who had done this, so either Jonathan or Christopher. And actually, a Detective Bowdish was speaking briefly with Joan when she was upstairs in the bed and paramedics were working on stabilizing her. And Bowdish kind of just said, Joan, I know you're in a lot of pain, but I need you to answer a few questions for me. Can you do that? And Joan nodded yes. Joan had completely had her jaw demolished. She was missing a lot of her teeth, so she wasn't able to speak, but she was able to nod. So he said, Joan, do you know who did this to you? And she nodded yes. And he said, Joan, was it someone in your family? And she nodded yes. And then he said, was it your son, Jonathan? And she nodded no. And then he said, was it your son, Christopher? And she nodded yes. He once again asked, just for clarification, Joan, can you confirm that it was your son, Christopher? And she nodded yes. And then she was whisked off to the hospital and actually put into a comatose so that she could recover from these major injuries. So while Joan was upstairs in the bed, Peter actually, believe it or not, you might be wondering, how did Peter end up on the floor downstairs by the front door? Well, Peter had actually gotten up despite 16 axe wounds to the jaw, face, and head and brain. Peter had gotten up at some point in the morning, went to the bathroom, walked down the stairs, started emptying the dishwasher, started preparing his lunch for the day, even went out to go get the paper, and then just dropped dead. So he was following his morning routine as per usual, the same routine he'd probably been doing for 20 plus years, even with these severe major axe wounds to his brain. There's crime scene photos that I will have inputted here in the video, but you can see blood everywhere. In the bathroom where he was, in the kitchen, in the dishwasher. Literally, he was dripping blood all over the home, and detectives were able to walk in his exact footsteps and follow his exact path that morning and piece it all together because of the sheer amount of blood that he was trailing around. This story of how Peter kind of subconsciously with his brain on autopilot went about his morning as normal, despite the fact that he was brutally attacked the night before, that specific story has become extremely well known and, for lack of a better word, popular amongst true crime listeners just because it's so rare and so equally haunting. And there's some small part of it that I find quite touching and almost like inspirational. The fact that his brain and his body wanted to like will him forward and wanted him to carry on with his day. Like, it's so amazing how the human brain and human body work, and just your muscle memory of doing routine and doing the same thing every day. It's so sad, obviously, and I don't want to undermine that, but there's some part of it that's fascinating in a way as well. So now that they had this confirmation from Joan in the moment that it was Chris who did this, they obviously rushed off to go find Chris. But they didn't have to search that hard because Chris had actually called in to police himself to check in on what had happened to his parents, because he had actually received a call from a local newspaper, the Times-Union, who had called him the morning of the murder and, just said, we've heard that this has happened to your parents. Would you like to provide a comment? Would you like an interview? So he was hearing about this for the first time through the newspaper who had contacted him. So he immediately hung up on them and called the police to get more information.
Hi, my name is Chris Porco. I was just called by the Times-Union saying that my parents were found dead this afternoon. I was wondering if you had any information on me.
Hey, Chris, whereabouts are you?
I'm at school in Rochester, New York.
Okay, you're in Rochester?
Yes.
Okay. And are you in a dorm there?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
As you could probably hear, based on his vibe in the phone call, he doesn't seem particularly panicked. He doesn't seem particularly upset. Granted, we can't really judge people on what the reactions would be. Everyone reacts differently to this type of crazy news. You never know how you would react. You could be in a state of shock. But he doesn't sound like how I would sound if I found out that my mom and dad had been brutally attacked with an axe the night before. Police came and met him at his dormitory at the University of Rochester, where they obviously asked him a few questions. Chris's alibi for the night before was pretty lackluster. He basically just said that he had actually slept on the dormitory couch, so kind of like the communal living space that night because someone else was using his room. And so he said he slept there for 8 hours and then just got up and went for a run in the morning around 8 a.m., went for a 1.5 mile run, and then came back. And as he was in his room just getting changed or whatever, that's when he got the phone call. That's kind of a shitty alibi, to be honest. I mean, he basically was saying, I was alone sleeping and then I was alone running. And not one student in that dormitory at the University of Rochester confirmed that they saw him that night or they saw him in the morning. They only saw him after his run. That was the only time they could confirm that they saw him. They did not see him throughout the night. I'm going to read some of this just from my notes just to make sure I get it correct, so bear with me. Some substantiating evidence to back up this story is that a New York State toll collector outside Rochester said that they saw a yellow Jeep Wrangler with large tires passing through the station around 10:45 p.m. on November 14th. So that was obviously the night that Peter was murdered. And a collector in Albany recalled the excessive speed of a yellow Jeep Wrangler approaching the toll plaza shortly before 2 a.m. on November 15th. So that's two witness accounts on the same night of a big yellow Jeep Wrangler with large tires speeding through these sort of toll collection stations. I don't know why, of all the vehicles Chris could buy, he chose a yellow Jeep Wrangler if he knew he was going to commit this crime in a few weeks, but he was an arrogant son of a bitch, I'll tell you that much. 4 security cameras at the University of Rochester recorded a yellow Jeep Wrangler once again, leaving the campus at 10:30 p.m. on November 14th and returning at 8:30 a.m. on November 15th. This being the period during which prosecutors claim the Porcos were attacked. A family member of the Porcos who lived on Broccoli Drive as well, one of them said that they saw a yellow Jeep Wrangler in the parking lot of the Porco family home at 4 a.m. So that's 3 eyewitnesses right there that said that they saw him on the move in this Jeep Wrangler, or maybe not him, but they saw this specific Jeep Wrangler on the move the night of the murder. So police believed that his alibi was bullshit and that he in fact drove the 3 hours to Delmar, committed this murder, and then drove the 3 hours back to end up in Rochester around 8:30 a.m. or 8:15 a.m. the next morning. As a result of this investigation, Chris Porco was arrested for the homicide of Peter Porco and the attempted homicide of Joan Porco. It became clear as investigators dug into Chris's dynamic with his parents and kind of the tensions that had been going on that this attack was maybe not quite as random as someone might have thought initially. It was clear that tensions had been building and frustrations had been building between Chris and his parents. Chris wanted to just suck them out of all the money that they had, and they were finally putting their foot down and wanting to put an end to this. He had a history of criminal and antisocial behavior, including forgery, theft, and burglarizing. He had stolen from the veterinary clinic where he was working at the time, and he had even broken into his own parents' house at some point in the past and stole a laptop and a computer from them. They were able to kind of link a few of these different crimes together because there was actually a window outside of the family home that had like a screen, and the screen had been cut, sort of slashed with a knife, and was left hanging open from the outside. And then the window was left open a little bit as well, just a few centimeters. So it looked, from an outside perspective, if you didn't play around with the window, it looked like someone had slashed and broken in through that window. But after the first burglary that I don't think his parents knew, but it was Chris who broke in originally a few years before. After the original burglary, Peter had actually put 2 nails above the windowsill so that you could only push it up a few centimeters to get a little bit of airflow in, but you couldn't push it all the way up. And he obviously did this in an attempt to prevent another burglary. But Chris didn't know this. So Chris thought, oh, I'm just going to slash this windowsill and it's going to look like some random person just broke in. No one will ever know. But like it took investigators 5 seconds to try to open the window and realize that it just wasn't possible. That was the same sort of MO that Chris displayed on both the night of the burglary in 2002 and the night of the murder of Peter Porco in 2004.
The earlier investigation where Joan's laptop was stolen, one of the screen windows, the screen was cut, okay, and the police thought that that was the means of entry to the burglar who stole Joan's laptop. In investigating the murder, the screen in the garage window was cut, okay? So there was like a commonality. Like if this was an intruder, you know, we've got the cut screen when an intruder got in one point in Thanksgiving, I think it was.
That's right.
The year before. And then the cut screen in the garage at the time of the homicide. That cut screen could not possibly have been a means of access, but it was, you know, a kind of a red herring that we suggested that Christopher left to make it look like somebody had broken in, except he didn't realize that, you know, Dad had basically secured that window. So if you cut the screen, you're not going to be able to get the window up.
So he had done this twice now, and he thought he was clever as hell. 1 month before the murder, Chris and Jonathan actually had their eBay accounts frozen because Chris was scamming people out of their purchases. So people would purchase things from him on behalf of Jonathan and then would say, oh, my brother Jonathan died. He was the one who was going to provide it, but he died, so I can't give it to you anymore, and would just like scam people out of their money. And because Jonathan was like linked to the same account as Chris, they both had their eBay accounts frozen. So Jonathan was fucking fed up with Chris. That's just a smaller example, though, of like the unethical and selfish behavior and criminal behavior that Chris was displaying before the murder even took place. Once again, I'm going to read from my notes just to make sure I get this correct. But Christopher was indicted for the charges of murder and attempted murder in November 2005. His friends, family, and even the owners of the veterinary clinic where he stole from, I don't think they knew that at the time, but he had stolen from them, all raised funds to post his bail because they all believed that he was innocent, so they raised $250,000 to post his bail. And while he was out on bail, guess where he was staying? With his mother, Joan Porco. That's right. Joan believed, despite what she originally said in the moment when the investigator was interviewing her, Joan believed that Chris was innocent. This is the second part of this particular case that people really latch onto and find disturbing and fascinating, is that even though Joan probably witnessed with her own eyes her son wielding an axe, she had such severe brain trauma that she said that she had lost all memory of that entire night. And for that reason, she did not know if it was him or not. She couldn't remember. She kind of took back her original statement that she believed it was Chris. And I don't know whether it's just that sort of maternal instinct to always protect your child, or whether she's just in denial because she's already lost her beloved husband and now she might lose her son. But she stood firmly by Chris's side throughout this entire trial. She did not waver in her support of him. She was at the court with him every single day. She let him stay with her during the trial proceedings. She gave him a hug all the time when he was upset during court. Like, craziness. Granted, a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, but there was a lot of it piling up that was pointing the finger directly at Chris. She still to this day believes that he's innocent. And I know it's so easy to just like roll your eyes and be like, what an idiot. But like, this woman, like, let's not forget what she's been through. And I feel like unless you're in that very specific situation yourself, you don't actually know how you'd feel or what you'd do. So I'm going to try to reserve judgment for Joan. The real criminal, the real shithead here is Chris Porco, and that's where all my judgment will go to. The trial against Christopher began on June 27th, 2006. And while he was out on bail, before the trial even started, Chris was actually out partying and drinking with friends. Just living his life, you know, just chilling, enjoying life. Like, what? And he was even seen on multiple occasions speeding his douchey-ass yellow Jeep Wrangler into the courthouse parking lot. And he almost hit someone at one point because he was speeding so fast in this Jeep Wrangler into the courthouse where he was on trial for murder. He was the definition of an arrogant son of a bitch, this man. Just a quick side note, but it is important. The fact that Joan had told that investigator in the moment when she had like literally just been brutally wounded, when she told the investigator that it was Chris, that was actually doomed to be hearsay and was not admitted into court as a viable piece of evidence. So although it did happen, the prosecutors and defense couldn't actually use that as a testament to his guilt or his innocence. So just going to say that. Joan would actually go on during this trial to write a letter to the Albany Times-Union to basically say that she was so disappointed in the way that this case was panning out. And she said, and I quote, "I wish they would leave Christopher alone and search for Peter's real killer or killers so that he can rest in peace and my sons and I can live in safety." So not only was she holding these doubts internally, but she was voicing these doubts to the public. She wanted to change the public opinion on her son's guilt. Another family member, though, who was convinced of Chris's guilt was his older brother, Jonathan. Jonathan was, as I said, pretty fed up with Chris's shenanigans that had been going on for years now. And during his testimony in court, apparently Jonathan could not even make eye contact with Chris. He was just absolutely disgusted by him. Jonathan believed that Chris had murdered his parents to try to gain access to their life insurance policy. And apparently, a few weeks before the murder even took place, Chris was telling different people at his university that he was going to come into a bunch of money in the coming weeks. He was going to come into $2.5 million, and he said he was going to get this from his grandmother. But when investigators probed him on this a little further, he just said, "Oh, I was just bragging. I didn't mean it. I was just bragging." But what I think is that he was referencing actually his parents' life insurance money, but he obviously couldn't say that, so he just said it was coming from his grandma. But he was mentally already celebrating the fact that he was going to get this money weeks before the murder even took place. In the trial, obviously, the alarm system code was brought up as a piece of circumstantial evidence, like nobody knew this code except for the sons and the parents, and who else would have done it, and Jonathan was obviously cleared at this point. Chris actually used the excuse, so to speak, that every single night the dog had to go out to pee in the middle of the night because the dog was more of a senior dog. So Peter would get up in the night to take the dog out to pee, and in doing so, he would disable the code. And this was like a nightly thing. And so Chris surmised that Peter had just forgotten to reset the code before going back to bed that night, and that's why the alarm was disabled. But, obviously officers were able to access the data from this alarm system, and they keep 15 days of data, like they keep that before they go into the next 15 days. So the 15 days leading up to the murder showed that the alarm had not been disabled once, except for the one night of the murder. So this was not a reoccurring thing that Peter was doing. Chris was just making this up as an excuse. Chris offered a lot of these really sort of shitty explanations for things and excuses for things, and I think he just thought in his narcissism and arrogance that it'll all work out for me, it'll be fine. He truly thought that he was going to get away with this, but every single one of his excuses or explanations just completely fell flat, and the evidence against him was stacking up. So on December 12th, 2006, Judge Jeffrey Berry sentenced Christopher Porco to 25 years of life on each count, totaling a minimum of 50 years in prison. During the sentencing, Judge Berry said, and I quote, "I fear very much what happened in the early morning hours of November 15th is something that could happen again." So Chris Porco was initially sent to Downstate Correctional Facility and was later moved to Clinton Correctional Facility in New York to serve his prison term. Chris has gone on to file all of his appeals, and they were all denied, so he is actually out of appeals now. Thank God, because I'm just pretty damn convinced, if you couldn't tell, that Chris Porco did this. He was actually diagnosed by professionals as either a sociopath or a psychopath, which are similar but slightly different diagnoses. They're like personality disorders, and essentially means that you're, a manipulator. You don't feel human emotion like other people do. You don't feel empathy like other people do. And I mean, you can look into the actual explanations, but you would see a big old picture of Chris Porco right beside the dictionary explanation or dictionary description of psychopath. He had two loving parents that, despite how much he mistreated them and stole their money and forged their signatures, they still stood by him and wanted to see him flourish. They reiterated their love for him. They said that they care about him, they care about their future, and he repaid them for this loyalty and this patience. He repaid them by axing them, one of them to death and the other nearly to death, because he wanted their money. He didn't care about them. He didn't care about the relationship. He cared about money, and he cared about himself, and he cared about his image and his ego, and he truly disgusts me to my core. And he still denies to this day, 20 years later since the crime happened, he still denies that he had anything to do with it. But I think we all know that it was Chris Porco. And Joan can believe whatever she needs to believe to get through the day, because I am not in Joan's position, and I truly pray to God I will never be in Joan's position. But I don't think I would believe my son if there was all this evidence against him. I just don't think I would. I mean, I guess blood runs thicker than water, but that wasn't even some sort of gentle, kind way to try to kill your parents. Not that there is a kind way to kill anyone, but that was a vicious, brutal, animalistic, barbaric way to kill somebody. And I believe a monster like this needs to be locked away in prison forever. There is no reason that Chris Porco needs to be roaming the streets with the rest of normal, civilized human beings. And that is the end of this case, guys. I kind of rushed through it a little bit because I actually need to head out to go to an event. That's why I'm so dolled up. But thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed this case. I hope it wasn't too crazy for you. Please support me and join this journey. I'm so excited to be doing this type of content. I've been thinking about it for years, and now I'm finally doing it. So I'm definitely proud of myself, but of course I need support to get to where I want to go. So you guys know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Leave comments below of cases you'd want me to cover, cases you want to know more about. I'm down to cover any case from all over the world. I don't have any restrictions necessarily, so let me know. And let me know what you think of this case, what your thoughts are, what your feelings are, and we can discuss it together in the comments. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you, and have a great day.